I attended grade school, junior high and high school with a girl named Sandy Fisher, and I have really no idea what has become of her because we were acquaintances and not real friends. And because we were acquaintances and not real friends, I really don't remember that much about her, save this. That girl's hand was always up. Anytime the teacher asked a question in class, bam, Sandy, first hand up, bam, with the right answer. I remember being in grade school that Sandy would cry if she weren't called on because she always had the right answer. And as someone who frequently didn't have the right answer, that irritated me. But I don't mean that literally. I mean, she was friendly and she had lots of friends, best that I can remember, but goodness, she had to have the right answer. Any time a teacher would ask the class a question, her hand would go up and everybody in class would have an eye roll. And I thought about her as I was preparing this message because I suspect she would have gotten along well with the man who's kind of front and center, besides Jesus, in the passage that we're going to read today. He's a man who gave the most famous right answer of all time. And his name is Peter, and we see his answer given in Luke chapter 9. So if you would please find Luke chapter 9 in your copy of God's Word, a passage that's probably going to be very familiar to you if you have any kind of background in church at all, and especially if you've come from a Catholic background. But if this is all brand new to you, no worries at all. We're going to walk through it together and see what there is to see. So I hope you found Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 18. And here's what it says. Now it happened that he, Jesus, was praying alone, and the disciples were with him, meaning that he was the only one praying, probably off at a distance. The disciples were nearby. And he asked them, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say that one of the prophets of old has risen." All right, some context here. The three Bible books that are called Gospels start the New Testament detailing the life of Jesus. The three Gospels that record this conversation always place this conversation after an event called the miraculous feeding of 5,000. And Luke, the book that we are in, places it immediately after that miracle. And so the context of Luke chapter 9 gives us a vibe something like this. Jesus said, "Let's talk. You've seen me just now do a pretty incredible thing." And then on top of that, the first 17 verses of Luke chapter 9 has shown us that these men, these 12 apostles, have done some pretty amazing things in the name of the Jesus that was their leader, and no less than Herod himself. And the community at large was beginning to ask questions. Well, who is this guy really? And so what did the 12 do? Well, they just repeat what we already know that everybody is saying in the community and what Herod is speculating. They give it actually almost verbatim to words we read last week. But in giving their report that some say, well, you're John the Baptist with a new head, and some say you're Elijah come back to life, and some say you're one of the Old Testament prophets, they had to know there was a part two to this question. And here it comes. Verse 20. But he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Because he knew all the other stuff. I mean, he was in tune with his community. He knew about the speculation. He knew all the other stuff. He was just setting them up. Everybody else saying this. "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter goes, boop. And he gives the most famous right answer of all time. Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Now, when Peter answers the Christ of God, it means that he has processed everything that he has seen and that he has heard about Jesus since encountering him for the first time along the Sea of Galilee. That he has filtered all of his experience with Jesus through the Jewish scriptures, and doing so, he has reached the conclusion that Jesus is the God-promised Messiah. Christ is just the Greek word for the Hebrew word, more or less, Messiah. Peter is saying, you're the one that we have been told to look for. Peter gave the right answer. Peter would have been an excellent proselytizing candidate in some of these evangelism training programs that tribes like ours have created over the years. Evangelism Explosion, Continuing Witness Training, and a whole host of others. Because most of those training methods encourage Christians to lead people who are inquiring about the faith through a presentation of truths about Jesus and about sin. And if at the end of that, the person gives the right answer, Jesus is the Christ of God, we say to them, welcome to the family of God. And what I'm about to say to you may sound crazy, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's never stopped me before. I think presentations like that in this particular cultural context in which we live have done more harm than good. Because they can make it seem like all that is required to follow Jesus is to have the right answer, to get an A or even just a passing grade on a theological quiz. And following Jesus means much more than just having the right answer about Jesus. So while Peter correctly identified Jesus as Messiah, Jesus is going to go on to explain to Peter and the other disciples what Jesus being the Messiah would mean for them beyond just having the right answer. And in doing so, he's going to explain it to us as well. Becoming a follower of Jesus requires more than just having the right answer. It means first that we need to understand the pattern of following Jesus, which has nothing to do with the right answer. Now listen to me. I think doctrine is important. Theology is important. I've given my life to parsing that and trying to be a good shepherd for you all. But it means more than that, and so we need to understand the pattern of following Jesus. When Peter gives the right answer, Jesus doesn't say to him, welcome to the family of God. Instead, Jesus does something that's kind of shocking. Verse 21, he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one. Jesus needs to go back to church growth school because that's not what you do. I mean, somebody gives the right answer, you say, you tell 5 people before you eat dinner tonight. You tell everybody. And Jesus goes, right answer, be quiet. Why would he do that? Why would he tell Peter not to tell anyone? Because the confession that Jesus was the Messiah was dangerous to Peter and anyone else who would make that confession at this time than they could possibly comprehend. And Peter couldn't truly confess that Jesus was the Messiah until he understood the danger that confession represented. For Peter and anyone else who would make that proclamation at this point in Jewish history, acknowledging Jesus as Messiah just meant, well, happy days are here again. For them, honestly, the Messiah was something like the Jewish avenger. He was the Iron Messiah. He was Captain Israel who had come to defeat Thanos or Rome or whatever. I've lost myself. And elevate Israel to some kind of central geopolitical supremacy. But for Jesus, the actual and not imagined superhero Messiah, being Messiah meant something much different than that. Look at verse 22. Tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. For Jesus, being Messiah, meant that he would be killed. Victory, his resurrection, wouldn't come until after the horrific trial. It wouldn't be experienced until after the death. The pattern for following Jesus, then, he is telling us here, the reason he's telling Peter to be quiet, is death before victory, suffering before glory. I don't know if you've ever heard the term prosperity gospel. Probably most of you have, maybe under a different name, name it, claim it, health, wealth, whatever. It's the corruption of the Christian faith that teaches that faith brings health, wealth, and happiness to believers. And when most of us think of the prosperity gospel, we tend to think of those guys. We tend to think of television preachers and multi-million-dollar homes flying multi-million-dollar jets. But listen to me, the prosperity gospel is much closer to home in this church and in your life than you might have ever dreamed. One of my favorite authors, you hear me talk about him a lot, is John Piper, and he's been a vocal critic of the prosperity gospel since its rise. And he says that one of the key indicators that it has taken root in a person or in a church is not a big house or a jet. It is that there is a lack of what he calls a robust doctrine of suffering. The Apostle Paul himself preached, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. He said that in Acts 14:22. He didn't say through many blessings we come into the kingdom of God. He says through many tribulations we've come into the kingdom of God. And so I've seen a belief take hold in the lives of family members and family friends and church members that assumes, it never outright says this, but it assumes that nothing bad will ever happen to a believer who is faithful to Jesus. And I've seen calamity come to some of those people that I love dearly, and I've watched their faith completely unravel because they never understood that faith and suffering are not only not mutually exclusive, they're compatible. And the reason we know that is because the one that we're called to follow modeled that. The one from whom we receive faith and salvation suffered. So in the simplest way I can explain it, the pattern for following Jesus is Jesus. And to commit to follow him is to follow him into suffering, should it come. Of course, the promised victory is there in the same breath, but he said that he would be raised from the dead on the third day after the cross. So you can't say you'll follow Jesus to the tomb until you're first willing to follow him to the cross. This is what Jesus is saying. That's the commitment that you make when you follow Jesus, to accept the pattern he set: suffering, then glory. We need to understand the pattern for following Jesus. Peter and the disciples didn't at this point. They just thought it was glory, and he said, be quiet. But then the next thing this passage shows us is that we must also understand the prerequisite for following Jesus, which is committing to the implementation in our lives of the pattern that Jesus set. So after having said that being the Messiah meant death and not Roman military conquest, Jesus says this in one of the more famous verses in the Bible. He says, if anyone would come after me, if anyone's going to make the confession that Jesus is the Messiah, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. There's actually 3 prerequisites there. Maybe a better way of saying it's preconditions for following Jesus that are mentioned in that verse. I call them prerequisites or preconditions because Jesus in that verse makes clear if anyone would come after him, if anyone would call him the Christ of God, if you're really thinking that you want to do this, here is what you are required to do. First, he says the person who would commit to follow him must deny themselves. And when we hear that, we think far too superficially. Church history's filled with tales of men and women who adopt a life of extreme asceticism in an attempt to fulfill this command, but it's just superficial. Let me give you the example of 2. Simeon the Stylite was a 5th century Syrian Christian who lived out his entire life on a platform about 3.5 feet square on a pillar 50 feet in the air in the modern city of Aleppo as a way of removing himself from the distractions of life. Then there's Julian of Norwich, who was a Christian in the 14th and 15th century who was called an anchoress. And an anchoress is someone who went through a ceremony where they were sealed in what was essentially a tomb with a small opening for air and food and water. She was sealed in that cell sometime in the 1390s and lived in it for over 20 years in an attempt to deny herself. Extreme, man, that's crazy kind of stuff. But superficial. Jesus is calling for something more extreme and comprehensive than those acts. To deny self meant to reject a life of self-interest and self-fulfillment in favor of abandoning oneself completely to the will of God for their lives. Now, I've been doing a book study with our empty nesters on Saturday morning, people like me who have launched their last kids into the world and are just waiting for Medicare to kick in. And we have, obviously, Saturday mornings free now. And so we get together, and we've been going through a book called Don't Waste Your Life. And in it, the author says, the greatest cause in the world is joyfully rescuing people from hell, meeting their earthly needs, making them glad in God, and doing it with a kind of serious pleasure that makes Christ look like the treasure he is. The life that is denied self will be consumed by that goal to their own suffering if need be. To achieve that as a life goal requires a denial of self-interest and self-fulfillment. We must deny self. And then Jesus says that we must take up our cross daily. This statement makes it clear that the pattern to be followed, which he talked about in the verses previous, is meant to be followed. And the meaning is clear. We must be willing to die in service of Jesus. Now, here's what we do when we hear that. We think, well, that's what we aspire to, right? I mean, when I'm really a good Christian, I will be willing to die for Jesus. That's not the context. That's not what he's saying at all. He's saying, taking up your cross, a willingness to die, is the point of entry. That's Christianity. That's Christianity 101. A willingness to pay that price is what is required to follow Jesus from the outset. Now, in my opinion, the person outside of Scripture who has articulated that truth better than anybody else is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian in the early part of the 20th century, who was murdered by the Nazis in a concentration camp in the final days of World War II. He wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship, and here's what he said. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with God. And then he says these famous words. When Christ calls a man, follow me, he bids him come and die. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. To which practically all of Western Christianity recoils. What a terrible pitch! What a terrible pitch. Nobody sells cars by saying, hey, come buy this car, and just so you'll know, after you factor in interest, you're going to pay about 25% more than what you think you're paying. Nobody does that. You'd never sell a car. So we want to say to Jesus, you don't tell people they're going to die. You don't want to tell them that at all. That's a terrible, terrible pitch. And so what we do is we go to our world and say, Jesus sure make you happy. Jesus will fix everything. Jesus will make all your wildest dreams come true like Pedro and Napoleon Dynamite. That's essentially what we say to people. But what if that against which Christianity recoils is that for which the world hungers? What if they're not looking for the lowest bar to clear? What if they're waiting to hear that Christianity is so transcendent, it's worth your very life? Maybe people aren't interested in Christianity is because we tell people it doesn't matter much. So Jesus is telling us that part of the entrance requirement of following him is being willing to die. Verse 24, he goes on to clarify this, to let us know it's really a pretty good trade. He says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. There was an American missionary in the 1950s, Jim Elliot, who famously died at the very beginning of trying to share faith with some Amazonian tribes. I mean, like literally they got off the plane and they were killed. And as he anticipated possibly losing his life, he said famously, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." This is what Jesus is saying in verse 24. The third prerequisite is simple then. Follow me. And what is lost in our English translations is that Jesus is saying in his own language, keep on following me. Not follow me once, that's what we do. When were you saved? When did you decide to follow Jesus? I followed Jesus however many years ago. Jesus is saying you keep on following me. It's that kind of language that he is speaking here. So it's not a commitment that we can choose to ebb and flow. It's a radical call to follow him. So are we tracking? Following Jesus requires more than just knowing the right answer about him. It requires that we commit to the pattern that he sets for us, suffering before glory. It requires that we commit to the prerequisites for following him, denying self, taking up the cross, and following him. And then we need to understand this last thing, the price for following Jesus. Look at verses 25 and 26. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Again, those are simple words, but they're explaining to us a very high cost of following Jesus. There were those in the early church who would lose everything they owned as the price of following Jesus. That is the subtext of the economic environment of the early Christians that is undergirding the entire book of Acts. There were those who would lose their standing in the community for making a public declaration of faith in Jesus. Part of the reason in the book of Acts you read about Christians in Jerusalem starving is because the declaration that Jesus was the Messiah cut them off from being able to even get a job. Is much different than the cultural Christianity that we live in here today, where Christianity is actually seen, or at least has been, as a good thing. Before I came to Blue Valley 17 years ago, I spent my entire ministry career either pastoring in a rural community or pastoring a small town that was a county seat, and as the pastor of First Baptist Church. And this is silly what I'm about to say to you, but it does, I hope, communicate. When you're the pastor of a First Baptist church in a small town, almost as soon as you show up, the local civic clubs begin to say, hey, be a part of our club. What I'm talking about, I'm talking Rotary Club. I'm talking Kiwanis. I'm talking Lions Club. And so when I arrived in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, First Baptist Church, Pryor, Oklahoma, First Baptist Church, those community groups would show up and say, "Hey, will you be in our club?" That's just so stupid. Will you be in our club? And the reason they wanted me to be in the club was because, again, I don't believe this is just the world that it was a catch to have the pastor of the First Baptist Church in their club. Now, to be fair, none of them could envision that I would ever preach wearing a shirt like this. At the time, they thought it was a big, big deal. And the thing is, in those kinds of churches, it was always kind of a big deal to be a member of it. So in the community, it kind of increased your social standing a little bit if you were a member of the First Baptist Church. It added to their prestige. So it's hard for us to imagine how following Jesus could ever cause us to lose our status or our stuff. But in Christian history, what we are experiencing now is the outlier. And I'd argue that it's the culprit behind the weak Christianity that has proliferated in our world for the last 75 years. There is a legendary conversation, meaning it probably didn't happen, between Thomas Aquinas and Pope Innocent II at the time when indulgences were building the Vatican. And the story goes that while counting a large sum of money, Thomas walked in and saw the Pope in there counting it out. And the Pope said, "You see, Thomas, the church can no longer say, 'Silver and gold have I none.' And Thomas is said to have replied, "That is true, Holy Father, but neither can she say, 'Rise and walk.'" There's no power. And there's no power to cultural Christianity. And it goes back to what I said earlier. We feel so poorly about what we're calling people to do that we feel like we have to dress it up. You know, have your best life now. Have a wonderful life. Everything's going to be cool if you'll just follow Jesus. And I believe that what the world is hungry for is something that matters. Have you noticed how hungry our world is to be a part of something that matters? And have you paid attention to all the stupid stuff that they're giving their lives to? Most of the world, and sadly a good chunk of us, are giving huge amounts of energy to things that don't matter and can't last. And maybe what the world is looking for is not the low bar to clear, but is instead a call to come and die. Another quote from "Don't Waste Your Life" comes to mind. Why don't people ask us about our hope? The author goes on to say the answer is probably that we look as if we hope in the same things they do. Our lives don't look like they're on the Calvary Road, stripped down for sacrificial love, serving others with the sweet assurance that we don't need to be rewarded in this life. It's not wrong to have what we have. It's not. It is wrong to live for what we have. It is sinful to grasp and try to hang on to what we have, because it says to the world, we hope in these things. And we also have Jesus. What Jesus is calling us to in this passage is to say, all I've got's Jesus. Everything I have on top of that is for Him and for His glory. And we must be willing, if we're going to say we're going to follow the suffering Jesus, to be willing to suffer and to, as He did, let loose of privilege for the sake of accomplishing the mission of God. In our culture, this week begins kind of a natural reset for us. I've always thought of it as kind of like a second New Year's Day for some reason. There's something about the annual start of school and the conclusion of summer at Labor Day that gives us all kind of a second wind for starting something new. We notice it in church life. Part of the reason our church year starts in September is because we're trying to leverage that, well, let's do this again kind of vibe. So let today's words from Christ cause us all to embrace the cost and commitment of what it means to follow Jesus. I'm saying that to the students. Those of you who are going to walk into our local junior high and high schools, those of you who are going to college. I'm saying to you, walk onto those campuses knowing and portraying that all I've got is Jesus and everything else is gravy. That I don't need anything else. Parents, show them what that looks like instead of chasing every lame dream that we want to chase. Senior adults who are in this room, and more of you were in the last service than in this service, but senior adults in this room, please do not show us that when we get to the end of our vocational lives, we can coast. Show us that you are freed up to give yourself more to the cause of Christ and the glory of Jesus than we ever have been. Show us that what you're going for in trying to retire is being a slave of Jesus to your utmost capacity when the time comes that you can leave behind your vocational life. Reorder your life, all of us. Reorder your life around the Jesus who says the pattern for following me is suffering before glory. The actual cost of following me is not pursuing your own happiness and fulfillment. And then do it. And let's see what God does in our world. Let's pray.